Hey everyone, I have a quick video today all about how to keep your gouache wet during a painting session. This is honestly one of the most asked questions and also one of the biggest frustrations I think for a lot of gouache painters. So I have 3 really easy ways for you to do this depending on what your workflow is like. Okay, so for my gouache setup, I use a removable tray from my watercolor palette. It's a palette that I got on Amazon for super cheap, like 15 pounds or something like that, and it has survived many years. And let me introduce you to your new best friend, the water bottle. You can find these in various sizes and really affordable at most stores, so take a look in your local retailer or online. If you're new to gouache, you probably don't quite realize how fast this medium dries, and in a matter of minutes, your gouache mixes might be completely dried over. Yes, you can reactivate them with water, but the second you start to reintroduce water to your mix, your colors are going to be more transparent. So if you prefer to work really thick, or you're trying to add some final thick details, something that's completely opaque, this is not going to be possible when you're reintroducing the water. With just a tiny spritz of water on the surface of your mixes, you can reactivate, you can give it life again, but it'll be very watered down. So another alternative to that is to simply get your brush wet and dip it in the dried mixes little by little. That will allow you to control the water a little bit better, but you're still going to have that issue of slightly more transparent colors. To avoid that problem, what I generally do is mix more than I think I need for a specific area, and then I try to fill in any of the areas in my painting that need that color. It's very difficult to color match a custom mix in gouache because once it dries on the paper, it will be a little bit lighter or a little bit darker. So unless you remember the exact amount of colors you mix together, it's going to be really hard to get it exactly right. But if you've already filled in the majority of the areas that need that special color, then if you just need to do a little touch up or a little dot of that color somewhere else, it won't be such a big deal if you don't match it perfectly. Now I'll show you a couple different setups, all of which I personally use, either in my studio or when I'm painting outside, and these different setups will allow you to keep the gouache a little bit moist for a little bit longer. The cheapest and quickest method is to use a paper towel or a rag. Cut a piece that is roughly the same length as your palette. Usually I fold mine over so it's slightly thicker. And then using your spray bottle or a really wet brush, you can simply sweep some water onto it and make sure it's pretty damp but not dripping. You'll notice that when you start to add your piles of gouache to the wet paper towel or rag, it's gonna soak in just a tiny bit, and especially when you start grabbing the color and mixing it on the palette. But trust me, the benefits of keeping the gouache wet for a longer time far outweigh any thoughts of being wasteful, like the paper towel is soaking up too much pigment. No, just forget that thought. It's so minuscule that it doesn't even matter. My second setup is something that I do when I have a little bit more time or know I'm going to be painting for a little bit longer. And I actually first found out about these Stay Wet palette papers and sponges when I used to paint with acrylics. So they are made for acrylic, but they work like magic for gouache. And just a quick heads up, any of the products that I mentioned today will be listed in the description below if you want to check them out for yourself. Obviously, I don't need a giant piece of sponge or palette paper for my palette. What I typically do is cut it down to the length of my palette, and the same thing for the sponge, although I usually do the sponge slightly wider. Next, I soak it in my water for a couple minutes, and I'll also get my palette paper a little bit wet, but then I'll make sure to remove any excess water because I don't want it to be dripping wet. Remove the sponge, give it a good squeeze, and place it on your tray. Place the palette paper on top and remove any drips or excess water. The fact that the sponge is wet is going to help keep everything in place, and it will feed moisture into the palette paper very slowly throughout the session. I definitely noticed that my gouache stays wet for much longer when I use this setup compared to any other setup. And I think it's because the sponge holds so much water and the palette paper itself can absorb a little bit of that water over time and it dries out much slower. My final setup is my palette box, or my watercolor box, whatever you want to call it. This is filled with all of my colors except white because I always put fresh white on my palette tray. Keeping the gouache confined in these little trays means that there's only one area, which is the top surface area, that's exposed to air. So all of the paint underneath that surface stays wet. So keeping a spray bottle on hand is very important because the moment you notice the tops of these the surface of the gouache drying out, you need to give it a teeny little spritz of water. And it's not enough to dilute the paint a lot, it's just to keep that surface moist. And if I notice I have too much water in there, I'll just take a paper towel and soak it up. If you're interested in using a palette box like this, please go watch my other video about how I paint with thick gouache and use a box, because it's important to maintain the quality of the gouache inside it and kind of check up on it once in a while. So I have lots of tips in that video for you. And there you have it. Those are my 3 main ways that I keep my gouache wet during my painting sessions, when I'm in the studio and when I'm outside. So I hope that helped you. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments below. And if this video was useful to you, please consider giving it a thumbs up. So go enjoy your gouache, get out there and paint. I'll see you again soon.